The afternoon sun now hits the floor of my new living room in a long, clean rectangle. The air smells like rosemary, simmering chicken broth, and the sharp, clean sting of fresh peppermint tea. I traded the studio apartment for a small house with a wide front porch and a doorway built low to the ground. Right next to the brick fireplace sits the old blue and green plaid armchair. I moved it out of Meadowbrook myself 3 weeks ago, its worn fabric finally clearing that hospital floor flavor out of its threads. My father, Desmond, was sitting in it. His small frame settled deep into the cushions. I sat on the low footstool by his knees and took his left hand. The skin on his wrist was still thin as tissue paper, but his breathing was slow, even, and clear. I reached into my pocket and pulled out his old Timex, the heavy steel one with the scratched crystal. The time was set perfectly to the minute now. I lined up the leather strap against his gay guoc wrist and slid the metal prong through the worn leather notch. "There you go, Dad," I whispered, smoothing the cuff of his clean flannel shirt. Right on time. The fallout from that Thursday morning at Capital Title moved through our family tree exactly like dry rot. Preston's brokerage closed its doors 48 hours after Stonewall Capital filed the default notice. He had to sell the German sedan just to cover his personal guarantee on the office lease. Della didn't call me again through FaceTime. She sent a short, single text message on a random Tuesday night. No demands for money, no bitter lectures about inheritance, just 2 words: "I'm sorry." The price of the truth turned out to be incredibly expensive for them, but it was a bill they finally had to pay on their own. Desmond reached down with his right hand and picked up his white ceramic mug. He took a slow, deep sip of the peppermint tea while it was still hot, closing his eyes as the steam hit his face. He didn't let it sit until a skin formed over the top like he did at the facility. When he set the mug down, his fingers fumbled inside the small front pocket of his cardigan. He pulled out a tiny, creased piece of yellowed notebook paper, folded into a square the size of a postage stamp. He laid it into my open palm. I unfolded the dry edges. It was my 6th grade advanced statistics test from 2004, a perfect score scratched in fading blue ink at the top. The margins were covered in his old oily thumbprints from the garage. He had carried that scrap of paper in his leather wallet for 22 years, through 2 strokes and 3 years of a drifting mind. He looked at me, his eyes completely grounded, a tiny, knowing smile touching the corner of his mouth. He hadn't forgotten me. He had just been waiting for the room to go quiet. Showing up for the people you love isn't glamorous work. It doesn't make for a beautiful social media post. And nobody hands you a trophy for sitting in a quiet room on a Sunday afternoon. But it's the only currency that ever carried any real value in this world. And my father knew exactly who'd been paying it all along. Are you the one who shows up? Or the one everyone assumes will? Drop shows up, or assumes in the comments below. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Let me back up to 3 years ago, before Meadowbrook even entered our vocabulary. I was sitting in Preston's living room, and the air smelled like his wife's expensive Le Labo perfume and pure pretense. My eyes burned from a 14-hour shift at the hospital, my neck stiff against the back of his plush leather armchair. Preston was pacing the hardwood, the metal band of his Apple Watch clinking against his silver cufflink every time he gestured. On the kitchen island, Della's face was framed in a FaceTime window on an iPad propped against a fruit bowl. She was laughing at something her husband said off camera, her voice tinny and sharp through the little speaker. My father had suffered his first minor stroke 48 hours earlier. He was still in a hospital bed downtown, but the transition plan was already being treated like a business liquidation. Preston stopped pacing and looked down the length of his nose at me. "The commercial market is brutal right now. Wren," he said, adjusting his watch. "I have 3 listings closing this month, so my days are completely shot." Della chimed in from the iPad screen, shifting her ring so the camera caught the diamond. And New York is 6 hours away by plane. Guys, I literally can't just drop my clients. Then came the command. Wren works the night shift anyway, Preston said, tossing a glossy Meadowbrook brochure onto the coffee table. You sleep during the day, so it's just basic logic that you handle the logistics. It wasn't a question. It was a corporate memo disguised as family unity. I sat there, my hands deep in the pockets of my worn jacket, completely isolated in a room full of my own blood. I'll handle the initial administrative holding fee, Preston announced, sliding his corporate Amex across the counter toward his broker partner. He didn't mention that the $3,000 deposit was being written off as a business expense on his company taxes, or that he was hoarding the airline miles from the transaction. He just wanted the credit for paying the bill, and everyone at that table let him take it. So Meadowbrook became my Sundays. The sun in Sacramento during October is thin, just a pale yellow strip cutting through the grease-filmed glass of the facility's common room. The air in there always smells like industrial floor wax and pureed peaches. I had dragged my father's old blue and green plaid armchair out of his house before Preston changed the locks, stuffing it into the back of my Honda. It sat in the corner by the radiator now, the left armrest slightly frayed where he used to rest his thumb while reading the paper. My father, Desmond, was sitting in it, his skin looking like old parchment under the low ceiling. A white ceramic mug of peppermint tea was sitting between us on the plastic side table, a white skin already forming over the top as it went cold. He hadn't touched it. I reached over and gently took his left wrist. His skin felt cool, the tendons thin like guitar strings under the surface. He was wearing his old Timex, the heavy steel one with the scratched crystal from his days pulling wire through crawl spaces. It was the first Sunday after the time change, and the watch was exactly 1 hour fast. I used my thumbnail to catch the tiny silver crown, clicking it out once to turn the hands back. Desmond didn't look at the watch. He was staring at a water stain on the acoustic ceiling tile. "The ledger is clean. Holloway," he muttered, his voice just a dry scrape in the back of his throat. "You check the 3-phase lines first. Holloway knows the count." I pushed the crown back in until it clicked. "Holloway's retired." "Dad," I said softly, wiping a bit of dried lint off the strap. "You're at Meadowbrook now." He just shifted his knees under the faded wool blanket, his thumb tracing the plaid pattern on the chair arm. I thought he was just drifting back to 1994, back when he still carried a tool belt and hired his old high school friend to look over his commercial contracts. Mrs. O.C., the weekend nurse supervisor, walked past our corner with a plastic tray of small medicine cups. She stopped, her heavy rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the linoleum. "Wren," she said, her voice dropping as she reached into her pocket. She handed me a small, square cardboard box and a folded piece of paper with the facility's letterhead. "These are the prescription supplements for his nerve pain. The office mailed the invoice to Preston's firm twice, but the Postal Service sent them back, marked, 'Return to sender, incorrect address.'" I unfolded the paper. $112. Preston had just moved his brokerage to a new suite on J Street 3 weeks ago, but he hadn't updated the billing records for the care home. Or maybe he just didn't care to. "If the balance isn't cleared by 5 tonight, the pharmacy system flags it as a missed delivery." "Mrs." Osei said, looking at the floor register. "They won't release the next refill on Tuesday." I didn't call Preston. I knew the corporate voicemail greeting by heart anyway. I pulled my wallet out of my scrubs, slid my personal debit card through the small card reader on Mrs. Osei's portable tablet, and watched the green light blink approval. My account balance dropped to 2-digit territory, but the little box stayed on the table. Desmond's fingers kept moving against the fabric of the chair, ticking like the watch I'd just reset. Preston chose a waterfront steakhouse near the marina for the 4th of July family dinner. The place smelled like charred wood, melted butter, and grease from the harbor outside. Yachts were bumping gently against the docks below the patio, and every 2 minutes, someone was clinking a heavy crystal glass of champagne. I sat at the very edge of the long table, still wearing the faded gray t-shirt I'd slept in after my Saturday night shift. My fingers were dry and chalky from the hospital soap. Preston was at the center of the table, his skin tanned and his linen shirt unbuttoned just enough to show his silver chain. Della's face was glowing from an iPhone screen propped against a wine bucket, dialing in from a rooftop bar in Manhattan. We had 3 premium floral arrangements delivered to Meadowbrook for the holiday, Preston announced, leaning back so the waiter could set down his dry-aged ribeye. White lilies and blue hydrangeas, Della chimed in through the speaker, her voice competing with the clinking silverware. The head nurse said Dad stared at them for hours. It's so important to keep his environment dignified. I picked up a piece of complimentary sourdough bread and chewed it slowly, the crust hard against my teeth. They hadn't seen the return to sender sticker on the prescription box. They didn't know I'd spent my grocery money for the week so Dad's legs wouldn't throb on Tuesday. Wren's basically married to that nursing home at this point, Preston said, tossing a smirk down the table toward Uncle Dale. She loves playing the martyr with the staff, sitting in that dark room every single Sunday. A low rumble of laughter went around the table. 15 relatives suddenly finding their wine glasses very interesting. Aunt Carol chuckled into her napkin. I didn't drop my fork, and I didn't yell. I just watched the ice melt in my water glass. Right then, Preston's phone buzzed on the white tablecloth next to his steak knife. The screen lit up with an automated notification from Chase Bank. It was a bold red header. Notice of default. Account ending in 4092. The first line of text under it read, "Immediate payment required to halt foreclosure proceedings." He flipped the phone face down so fast his water glass rattled against the salt shaker, his smile freezing for just half a second. He took a massive gulp of his Cabernet and immediately redirected the conversation to his new listing on the river. Type, "Same" in the comments if you've ever been the only one in the family who actually showed up while everyone else collected the praise. Seriously, drop a comment. Let me know you're here. And then stay with me for what Preston did next. The room smelled like grocery store vanilla frosting and the damp wool coats of 18 elderly people. We were in the Meadowbrook Annex for Dad's 81st birthday. Preston arrived late, the heels of his leather loafers clicking aggressively against the linoleum. He didn't bring any balloons. He carried a sleek, black leather portfolio under his arm like he was stepping into a foreclosure meeting. Della's face was propped up on the corner of the table via FaceTime, her screen reflecting off the plastic punch bowl. The party hadn't even reached the second chorus of Happy Birthday before Preston unzipped his portfolio. He pulled out a thick stack of legal-sized paper and laid it flat right next to Dad's paper plate. A bright yellow sticky note was plastered on the bottom page with an X scratched in blue ink. It was a standard California real estate purchase agreement for Dad's house on Oakwood Lane. Preston pulled a silver pen from his pocket and pushed it into my hand. "We need this finalized before the county clerk's office closes on Thursday. Wren," he said, his voice dropping into that smooth, low broker tone. "The liquid assets are drying up, and I can't keep carrying the weight of his premium care fees alone." He looked at Dad like he was looking at an unrented storefront. "Wren is the one who handles the day-to-day admin here anyway," he added, turning to the room of uncles and old electricians. "Sign it on behalf of the estate. Wren, let's make this quick so Dad can enjoy his cake." I didn't take the cap off the pen. I stood right in front of my father's wheelchair, my back blocking Preston's view of the old man's face. I looked Preston dead in his eyes. "No." The room went dead silent, the only sound being the low hum of the vending machine in the hallway. Preston's jaw unhinged, the smooth broker facade cracked, his neck turning a dark, blotchy red. "Are you losing your mind?" he gnarled, leaning over the table until his chest hit the paper plates. "You've been playing the saint in scrubs for 3 years. Wren, but you don't know a damn thing about real arithmetic." He pointed his silver pen at my face. "You want to keep a rotting piece of wood on oak wood just so you can feel nostalgic? While your family is out here drowning under the real bills?" Della's FaceTime screen went completely mute on the table, her camera tilting toward her ceiling as if she was suddenly checking the lighting. Nobody at the table stood up. But beneath the plastic tablecloth, out of everyone's sight, a cool, dry hand suddenly clamped around my wrist. It wasn't a shaky, frail grip. It was firm. I looked down, and my father's pale blue eyes were locked onto mine. The cloudy, drifting stare he'd used for months was completely gone. His eyes were clear, sharp, and absolutely grounded. He gave my wrist one slow, deliberate squeeze, signaling something that didn't need a single word to be understood. I pulled into the gravel lot of the old brick building downtown at 10:14 p.m. The wipers on my Honda were slamming back and forth, barely catching up with the Sacramento downpour. In my lap, I held a wet plastic grocery bag stuffed with 3 years of Dad's unpaid medical bills and those returned pharmacy invoices from Meadowbrook. The glass front door of the office still had Thomas Halloway, attorney at law, painted in gold lettering that was flaking at the edges. Inside, the hallway smelled exactly like old sheepskin law books, cedar shavings, and wet wool. Halloway was sitting behind a massive desk under the dim glow of a green banker's lamp. He didn't look like a high-powered corporate lawyer. He was 76, wearing a faded cardigan, and his fingers were spotted with ink. I dumped the plastic bag onto the leather blotter. "Preston's trying to close a sale on the Oakwood house this Thursday," I said, my voice thick with the cold I'd been fighting all week. "He's telling the facility that Dad's accounts are dry, but he's the one routing the bills to a dead corporate address." Halloway looked at the crumpled invoices, then reached into his bottom drawer. He didn't pull out a lawsuit template. He slid a thick, cream-colored manila folder sealed with a heavy red wax stamp across the polished oak. "Wren, your brother doesn't have the authority to list that property," Halloway said, his glasses sliding down his nose as he looked at me. "He hasn't had it for a long time." He broke the wax seal with a small silver letter opener. "2 years ago, your father called me from the hospital after his second cardiac event. The staff had tried to reach Preston 3 times between midnight and 2 in the morning because Dad needed an emergency shunt. Preston's phone was set to Do Not Disturb because he had a morning flight to a real estate convention in Phoenix." Halloway turned a page in the folder. "Desmond realized that night who actually answers the phone when the light goes red. We executed a durable power of attorney and a full healthcare proxy right there in the ICU while Preston was in the air. He gave total financial and medical control to you. Only you." My heart hammered against my ribs, the sound of the thunder outside echoing the ebbing fog in my brain. "But the house," I started, my fingers catching on the edge of the desk. "The house isn't even part of his personal estate anymore," Halloway said, pushing a certified deed copy toward me. 3 years ago, before the first stroke even hit, Desmond moved the Oakwood title into a revocable living trust. He named you the sole successor trustee. Preston's listing agreement is a dead piece of paper. He's selling an asset he doesn't own to cover a debt he can't run from. If you found out you were the only one holding the key to your family's future, would you speak up immediately or wait for the right moment? Comment, wait, or speak below. I want to see what you'd do, and then stay tuned for Thursday morning. I drove straight to Oakwood Lane on Tuesday morning. The air was damp and smelled like rotting oak leaves and wet cedar. Dad's old driveway was cracked, with dry dandelion stalks pushing through the asphalt. Right there, tucked behind the overgrown juniper bushes near the gas meter, Preston had clamped a black metal realtor lockbox. The paint on the lockbox was fresh, still smelling like cheap factory plastic. I didn't try to pry it open or kick it off the pipe. I didn't need to. I pulled out my phone and took a crisp photo of the listing sign he'd shoved into the soil near the mailbox. Preston Callahan Properties. Off-market exclusive. I was leaning against my car door, saving the images to my cloud drive, when my phone buzzed with an incoming call from an area code 212. Della. Rennie. Sweetie. Her voice came through the speaker, full of that rehearsed New York gallery owner warmth. Look, Preston called me after the birthday dinner. He's completely stressed out about the brokerage accounts. I could hear the distinct clink of a porcelain espresso cup against a saucer on her end. You need to stop being so stubborn about the Oakwood house, she said, her tone dropping into that soft, patronizing purr. Dad doesn't even know what year it is half the time anymore. Property is for the living. Wren. Preston promised me he'd wire you $50,000 for your graduate school tuition the second the title clears. $50,000. A bribe wrapped in sisterly concern. I'll think about it. Della, I said, my voice completely flat against the morning chill. Good girl, she said, and hung up. I walked up the porch steps, picked up a discarded real estate packet Preston had left on the wicker chair, and flipped to the addendum page. Holloway was right. Preston hadn't just listed the house. He had already executed a contract with Stonewall Capital Group. Right there in Clause 4, typed out in clean courier font, was a specific penalty provision. If the seller failed to deliver a verified, unencumbered clean title by Thursday at 10 o'clock a.m., individual broker Preston Callahan owed the buyer $45,000 in liquidated damages, $45,000 out of his own pocket. He hadn't built a trap for me. He'd bought the rope and tied his own knot. The air in Conference Room B at Capital Title Services was thick with the smell of warm toner and cheap office coffee. A giant laser printer in the corner was churning out closing disclosures with a low, rhythmic rattle. Preston was already seated at the massive mahogany table, his gray linen suit jacket draped over the back of his chair. He was tapping the edge of a gold-plated Mont Blanc pen against his knuckle. Looking at his watch every 30 seconds, Della's face was propped up on an iPad near the window, her screen occasionally lagging due to the weak office Wi-Fi. I walked in at exactly 9:58 a.m. I didn't bring a fancy leather portfolio. I just carried a faded canvas grocery bag, the handles dug deep into my palm. Inside was the manila folder Holloway had given me. I took a seat at the far end of the oval table, right under the direct glare of the fluorescent lights. Linda Yates, the escrow officer, sat at the head, her glasses resting on a silver chain around her neck. Preston slid the final deed disclosure toward her with a broad, easy smile. We're all set here, Linda, he said, nodding toward the iPad. The family has fully reviewed the terms, and we're ready to execute the transfer on behalf of my father. Linda Yates didn't pick up her signing pen. She flipped to the first page of the title report and looked over her frames. Before we sign, I need the verified signatory for the estate, she said. Who here holds the active, durable power of attorney for Desmond Callahan? Preston laughed, a short, sharp sound that didn't reach his eyes. I'm his eldest son. Linda, he said, his palm coming down hard on the mahogany surface. I've been managing his brokerage filings for 3 years. The authority defaults to me. I didn't raise my voice. I reached into my canvas bag, pulled out Holloway's certified documents, and slid the stack across the smooth wood. The paper slid silently until it hit the edge of Preston's coffee cup. Preston's authority doesn't exist, I said, my voice completely level. Linda Yates picked up the papers, her eyes tracking the notary seal and doctor. Mercer's capacity evaluation from 2 years ago. The room went completely quiet, save for the printer in the corner. Preston's face went from a confident flush to the color of wet sidewalk cement. This transaction cannot proceed, Linda Yates said, setting the papers down flat. The Oakwood property was transferred into a revocable living trust 3 years ago. The individual power of attorney your brother holds is legally blind to this asset. The sole successor trustee is Wren Callahan. Daniel FSY, the buyer's rep from Stonewall Capital, didn't wait for Preston to speak. He stood up, zipped his leather portfolio, and reached for his coat. "We're done here," FSY said, looking right past Preston. "You guaranteed a clean title by 10 o'clock a.m. Callahan. Our legal team will be filing the default notice for the $45,000 liquidated damages before noon. Don't call our office." The glass doors of Capital Title Services hissed shut behind me, cutting off the hum of the laser printer. Outside, the Sacramento rain had finally stopped. The air was sharp, biting cold, but so clear you could smell the damp asphalt and the wet pine needles from the Civic Plaza across the street. Down in the gravel parking lot, Preston's leather loafers were kicking up mud as he paced between the parked sedans. He didn't have his jacket on. His silver cufflink caught the pale morning sun as he held his phone to his ear, his voice a raw, desperate scratch that carried across the concrete. "Jerry, listen to me. Do not process that default notice yet," he barked, his free hand chopping through the air. "It's a clerical delay. We have the title. We just need 24 hours to clear a secondary administrative flag." He hung up, dialed again immediately, his thumb shaking so hard he dropped his silver pen into a puddle. I stood on the top concrete step, my hands resting deep inside the pockets of my dark coat, just watching him spin his wheels. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. I just felt light, like a heavy coat I'd been carrying through a swamp had finally slipped off my shoulders. Preston's iPad was still clutched under his arm, the screen still live. Della's face was still there, the frame freezing and thawing as he swung his body around. The background noise of her New York rooftop bar was gone. She'd walked inside somewhere quiet. For 2 full minutes, her tiny speaker just emitted flat, dead static. Then, her voice came through, stripped of the purr, sounding small and entirely hollowed out. "God damn it, Preston," she muttered, her eyes staring at something off-screen on her end. "Shut up for a second. Just shut up." Preston froze, his phone still pressed to his cheek. "Dad chose the one who actually showed up," Della said, the words cutting right through the crisp morning air. That's actually fair, isn't it?" Preston didn't look at the screen. He lunged toward the steps, stopping 3 feet below me, the smell of his Cabernet and sweat hitting me instantly. "Wren," he whispered, his eyes wide, bloodshot, looking up at me the way he used to look at the bank managers before his store went under. "Listen to me. The brokerage is done if Stonewall files that default. They'll pull my license by Friday. We're family. Wren, you have to use the trust asset to back collateral for a bridge loan. Just a 30-day note. For Dad's sake." He held out his hands, palms up, the gold-plated pen gone, the old reflex to keep the piece flinched in my chest. Then it went completely cold. I looked down at his blotchy face. "You hung up on the care home 3 times when his vitals dropped into the red. Preston," I said, my voice carrying further than his galing shouts. "You set 3 place settings at the table on Ladakh Lap and told everyone I was a footnote." I took the manila folder out of my bag and held it tight against my ribs. "You don't get to sell my father to buy your salvation." The afternoon sun now hits the floor of my new living room in a long, clean rectangle. The air smells like rosemary, simmering chicken broth, and the sharp, clean sting of fresh peppermint tea. I traded the studio apartment for a small house with a wide front porch and a doorway built low to the ground. Right next to the brick fireplace sits the old blue and green plaid armchair. I moved it out of Meadowbrook myself 3 weeks ago, its worn fabric finally clearing that hospital floor flavor out of its threads. My father, Desmond, was sitting in it, His small frame settled deep into the cushions. I sat on the low footstool by his knees and took his left hand. The skin on his wrist was still thin as tissue paper, but his breathing was slow, even, and clear. I reached into my pocket and pulled out his old Timex, the heavy steel one with the scratched crystal. The time was set perfectly to the minute now. I lined up the leather strap against his gay guac wrist and slid the metal prong through the worn leather notch. "There you go, Dad," I whispered, smoothing the cuff of his clean flannel shirt. Right on time. The fallout from that Thursday morning at Capitol Title moved through our family tree exactly like dry rot. Preston's brokerage closed its doors 48 hours after Stonewall Capital filed the default notice. He had to sell the German sedan just to cover his personal guarantee on the office lease. Della didn't call me again through FaceTime. She sent a short, single text message on a random Tuesday night. No demands for money, no bitter lectures about inheritance. Just 2 words. "I'm sorry." The price of the truth turned out to be incredibly expensive for them, but it was a bill they finally had to pay on their own. Desmond reached down with his right hand and picked up his white ceramic mug. He took a slow, deep sip of the peppermint tea while it was still hot, closing his eyes as the steam hit his face. He didn't let it sit until a skin formed over the top like he did at the facility. When he set the mug down, his fingers fumbled inside the small front pocket of his cardigan. He pulled out a tiny, creased piece of yellowed notebook paper, folded into a square the size of a postage stamp. He laid it into my open palm. I unfolded the dry edges. It was my 6th grade advanced statistics test from 2004, a perfect score scratched in fading blue ink at the top. The margins were covered in his old oily thumbprints from the garage. He had carried that scrap of paper in his leather wallet for 22 years, through 2 strokes and 3 years of a drifting mind. He looked at me, his eyes completely grounded, a tiny, knowing smile touching the corner of his mouth. He hadn't forgotten me. He had just been waiting for the room to go quiet. Showing up for the people you love isn't glamorous work. It doesn't make for a beautiful social media post. And nobody hands you a trophy for sitting in a quiet room on a Sunday afternoon. But it's the only currency that ever carried any real value in this world. And my father knew exactly who'd been paying it all along. Are you the one who shows up? Or the one everyone assumes will? The drop shows up, or assumes in the comments below. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.